Hi everyone, I'm Ansley Hamilton. Welcome to another episode of Real Talk. Today I have my friend. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Hello, my name is Julian.
And Julian is a big wrestling fan, isn't that right?
Yes, in more ways than one.
So today we are going to be talking about all things wrestling. I myself do not know that much about wrestling, but I do know a lot about fumbling my way through conversations. So I will have several opinions that I have zero circumstantial evidence to back up. But I cannot wait to find out more about wrestling. So first of all, I guess, how are you into wrestling?
Well, I really just like all forms of like grappling martial arts and all that. I got into wrestling when I moved from Jacksonville to Georgia for the first time. Um, I just was kind of like at a loss in my life at that point. I didn't know what I was going to do without my friends and all that. So I grew really attached to pro wrestling, and that introduced me. So I went from like WWE to like real wrestling, real wrestling.
We'll get into that later.
I'll get into the differences later. But yeah, I got me into doing folk style wrestling, and from there I got into jiu-jitsu and other forms of grappling martial arts.
Coolio. So right off the bat, like in terms of like being a fan of the kind of cultural phenomenon that is wrestling and the wrestling fan base, who's your favorite wrestler?
My all-time favorite wrestler would... That's a hard question. I have like two that come straight to mind. The first one's Kurt Angle. He was the person that got me into wrestling. He's an Olympic gold medalist in freestyle wrestling. He won it with a broken neck, which...
Whoa.
Yeah, that's something people would bring up. But yeah, he's what made me want to do both real wrestling and pro wrestling. And he's just like this weird, funny... Like, he's someone that can be both extremely funny and goofy and ridiculous, but also can be someone that's like... How do I say it? Also like very serious, straightforward, violent wrestler. He's awesome. Second person that comes to mind is Eddie Kingston. Relatability in wrestling is very not common, at least for some people, because like, you know, most wrestlers are like either super jacked or super athletic, but Eddie Kingston, he's just a guy from New York, you know, half Puerto Rican, half Irish, grew up fighting, so he just started to continue fighting and wrestling. And the way he speaks, like, I know wrestling isn't known for like acting, but that man's like a word poet. Like, his promos are just so emotional and well like thought out. There's no one like him in anything, I think.
I respect that. There is a lot of theatricality to be said that goes into wrestling. Because, like, obviously the biggest kind of controversy over wrestling is, like, how much of it is real, how much of it is fake. Does that really matter? I know that a lot of people are really attached to these, like, story arcs of wrestlers, like, throughout their careers. Like, when a big wrestler gets, like, brought back into the ring for, like, a promo event, it's, like, a big deal. Because that dude has a story. That is now, like, part of his canon as almost a character within the wrestler. So, like, I guess, what do you think about, like, the realities of wrestling? What's real versus not real? Does that even matter? Who do you think takes it too far, if anything?
I've done both folk style and pro wrestling. I did train for pro wrestling for a bit. So, with folk style wrestling, it's like a legit sport. It's probably the hardest sport in the world. And it's very intense, very quick. Whereas pro wrestling, it hurts. It does hurt. Nothing that is done in pro wrestling doesn't hurt, at least a little bit. But there's more dramatics to it. The matches are longer because as wrestlers are able to take time during the match to like breathe and think and all that. So, I mean, I don't want to expose too much about pro wrestling, but it's really different. Like, because with pro wrestling, it's the only like art form where the character and the actor are always like around, basically, if the best way that I could say it. For example, like, let's say The Rock. Like, he's The Rock, but he's also Dwayne Johnson. And when he was wrestling, he was always both, you know? You can't really like stop being them, especially in like companies like the WWE, where they frequently tour and they have like 3 shows a week. You can't really stop being yourself, so you have to kind of like find a thin line between reality and the wrestling world. And as for who takes it too far, there's a lot of like older wrestlers who are like very committed to the wrestling act and, you know, never breaking kayfabe. In terms of modern wrestlers, the first I can think of is a guy named MJF, who is always an asshole to everyone. He's 100% in character at all times. You can literally find pictures of him at conventions flipping off children.
Oh, dang.
So he's determined to fit his character.
Very, very in character. Or maybe that's just who he is. The point is that we don't know.
Exactly.
But that's fun. Alright, so let's get into the nitty gritty. Let's really expose the wrestling scene for all that it's worth. One, do you think WWE is like the end all be all of standard of wrestling? And two, are you like aware of like the controversies that go on within like the wrestling community involving like safety regulations for pro wrestlers and like actually dangerous and life altering stunts being done that kind of aren't being properly accounted for?
Okay, so for the first question, no, I don't think WWE is the end all be all. Because really, I feel like it already depends on the person, but I feel like it depends on what you want your art to be.
Mm-hmm.
If you want to be like a super billionaire celebrity like John Cena and The Rock, and you want to wrestle at WrestleMania in front of the biggest crowd ever, that's you. But like, for me, for instance, I really don't care about how many people are watching, but how I affect them when I watch. The WWE is a very scripted, entertainment-focused company, which is fine, because that's what they do. And some people like it, and some people don't. But I personally I don't believe there's any end-all, be-all. I think there's just places with people, and some people you want to wrestle, and some people you don't.
Well, it's like, do you think there's another, maybe, like, circuit that does it better?
In terms of American pro wrestling, right now I like All Elite Wrestling more. That has my favorite wrestlers of all time, Eddie Kingston, Bryan Danielson. Like, some of the greatest all-time performers are at that company right now. They are not perfect. They have a lot of things that I do not like. But in terms of having a good set of variety and quality, they're pretty good.
Okay, so there's things that you, like, don't like. What's, like, I guess your biggest complaint about that? And then what's your biggest complaint about, like, the wrestling world? Let's get into the controversial takes. What are the Julian's hot takes on the wrestling world?
I would have to say, in terms of, like, in terms of hot takes, I mean, there's a lot of wrestlers I find overrated. Like, I don't like Undertaker. I don't like Hulk Hogan.
Whoa.
Well, Hulk Hogan's like... But, yeah, there's a lot of popular wrestlers I don't like. But in terms of, like, the actual industry as a whole, I think the biggest problem now is how representation is utilized. Like, for example, this is something that I've been thinking about for a bit. But when it comes to Latino wrestlers, we are only labeled as, like, luchadors. Most of the time, it's usually luchadors that get represented. And luchadors are never, like, people that can be seen as, like, world champions unless they're in, like, you know, Mexico and Puerto Rico and all that. But even then, like, you know, there are a lot of Latino wrestlers out there that don't wrestle in the lucha style. Some that I'd like to shout out: Robert Martyr, Eddie Kingston, of course, Homicide. But for the most part, when people are talking about Latinos in wrestling, they're thinking of Rey Mysterio, Eddie Guerrero, those guys. And those guys are amazing, do not get me wrong. But I feel like because of that label, people only think that they belong in, like, the middle of the card, never in, like, the main event.
Mm-hmm.
Or the opener that, like, wows people, and then that's it. And also, and it's not just Latinos, because All Elite Wrestling, the promotion I mentioned earlier, does have some representation problems. Their women's division is fairly weak. They have great women's wrestlers, but they only have, like, 1 or maybe 2 women's matches per episode. But, and yeah, I mean, and it's not just with WWE and AEW, it's in the independents too. There have been some wrestling shows on the indies that have been trying to, like, promote bigger representation. Shout out to AJ Gray's For the Culture, which is dedicated to having all black talent on their shows. And also shout out to Effie's Big Gay Brunch, which is focused on having LGBT wrestlers showcased, from trans to, you know, gay, bisexual.
I bet those are some great performances.
Oh, there's amazing. Shout out to Dark Chic and Edith Surreal. They're both fantastic. But yeah, representation. And from my experiences, like, with wrestling, is that at the end of the day, everyone sees pro wrestling differently. So there's a lot of disagreements. A lot of people don't see the art the same way some people see it. And I've met a lot of people in the industry. Some, well, pretty big names if you follow wrestling, but not if you're just non-wrestling fan.
A casual like me who doesn't know anything.
Yeah, but I've seen them like how they talk about wrestling, what they think about wrestling, and they're all different. And it's good because I think wrestling, like all films, or not all films, but like all forms of art, should have different genres.
Mm-hmm.
Comedy wrestling is great. Deathmatch wrestling is great. Just normal, technical, pure wrestling is great. They're all good, for their own things. But a lot of people don't see it that way. Some people think wrestling should be just how they remember it when they were kids, and that kind of really kills some of the passion for it.
Yeah, I guess there is more of an industry perspective that you got to take now. And it's almost like its own section of television. WWE is almost more like a studio than it is almost a wrestling circuit.
And it feels like that. Like, especially if you watch WWE nowadays, it is very formulaic, very broad appealing. But, like, for example, they recently had the Royal Rumble event. And now this is just my personal opinion, but I thought it was terrible.
Oh.
It was awful.
Oh no. Do you think other people also felt the same way? Like, have you seen that shared opinion?
People felt that way.
Okay, so the Royal Rumble was a kind of a fumble, a royal fumble.
I knew you were setting that up too. But yeah.
Okay, so why was it not what people were looking for?
Well, with that specific event, to explain it, it's basically a giant battle royale where 30 people. It's like, how do I explain this? So basically, it starts with 2 people, and then the timer goes off, and then another person joins, and people keep joining until 30, and whoever's the last one in the ring wins. And what a lot of people like about this match is it, having surprises, having recognizable names, having creative moments. But this year's Rumble, like, the only people that were surprised was Bad Bunny, the reggaeton musician, who's a big fan of pro wrestling. It's actually pretty good for, like, a non-wrestler celebrity. Mm-hmm. And Shane McMahon, the son of the owner of the company, who isn't really that great of a wrestler. Yikes. I mean, he's entertaining, but he's not like... He's also old. So, there was nothing... And also, WWE has a problem with its writing, where basically earlier in the night, Brock Lesnar, former UFC champion, lost the WWE Championship to Bobby Lashley. Mm-hmm. And then... he just showed up in the Rumble, and whoever wins the Rumble gets a shot at the WWE Championship. And he just wins it again. So it's just going to be a rematch between... It's either going to be Brock Lesnar takes on Bobby Lashley again, or he takes on Roman Reigns. And for anyone who has watched WWE for a long time knows, they fought like 50 different times, and it was always kind of boring, because they don't really go well with each other.
Okay. Interesting. So it's like they were trying to set up like a climactic rematch event for later, kind of like by giving people like... kind of leaving it almost like as a cliffhanger as to who's gonna be like who's gonna win the world championship, but then it just is kind of setting up like another kind of substandard match. It seems like. Yes,
because the thing is with WWE is that, and with most wrestling companies, it's usually the same people at the top, and then there's people in the middle, and there's people at the bottom, and like. I like some of the people on the top, but sometimes with these companies, they don't mix it up, Right. There are people that I think could be fantastic as, like, the top-tier champion. Like, for example, someone I like to shout from WWE, Cesaro, is a freak of nature. This man is, like, the most strongest person in the company, despite being not smaller, necessarily, but he's not, like, super, like, big and muscular like Brock Lesnar, but he can, like, lift guys like Brock Lesnar over his head. With no problem. He is insane. But he's never won a championship. Because there's this kind of thing in wrestling where you have to get the brass ring, essentially. You have to do everything and anything to get the title. And, unless the boss or whoever's writing, likes you, it's not going to happen.
Oh, gotcha. So it sounds like a lot of really amazing, actual authentic come-ups that could have happened and should have happened were ruined by good old nepotism. God, we love to see it.
Not even just nepotism, because it's not always relatives, but sometimes it's just
it's favorite. It's picking favorites.
Yeah. it's very common in wrestling, and it's very unfortunate because there are some wrestlers that I consider legends, at least, who have never won major titles in the WWE. But like I said, I don't really think that's partially also why I don't think they're the end all be all. I think as long as you do what you love and you're passionate about it, and you want to just make a difference in it, your influence will be remembered for years. Like, Amazing Red has never wrestled in the WWE. He's another Puerto Rican wrestler. But he's someone that everyone, whether it's in WWE, AEW, the independents, everyone has copied from him. Even Rey Mysterio, one of the greatest of all time, has admitted from stealing from him. So,
wow. So stealing is kind of like almost like a form of flattery in this case.
well, I mean, sometimes. Because, like, a lot of people, like, there's some wrestlers that will get mad if you, like, use their finisher. Which is dumb because, like, everyone has used the same move in wrestling once.
Right.
I mean, it's kind of hard to make original moves in wrestling. Because there's only so much farther you can go up. And it gets to the point where moves that were once finishers, and, like, would end matches, just end up becoming, like...
kind of commonplace.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely I can see that happening. Because, like, finishers just got to become bigger and bigger and bigger because it's showmanship.
Right.
So the Royal Rumble was not what we were looking for. What do you think? Like, what do you think the greatest wrestling match of all time in your memory is? Like, what is your favorite wrestling match that you've ever seen?
Oh my god, that's a hard question.
That's such a hard question. Okay, I'll start with what's your favorite wrestling style? Because you mentioned lucha style, and I know there's also classic sumo wrestling. There's grappling. I guess you can also consider like jiu-jitsu a type of wrestling.
Well, it kind of gets complicated because jiu-jitsu and wrestling, like traditional folk style wrestling, is focused on like pinning your opponent, like having their back on the mat for like 2 or 3 seconds if it's pro wrestling, whereas jiu-jitsu is more focused on submitting your opponent. Now, when MMA became popular, that's when pro wrestling started using jiu-jitsu elements, so that's why submissions became really popular, and that's how tapping out became a thing in pro wrestling. There are forms of wrestling with submissions. Catch wrestling, which was innovated, which is one of the like forefathers of pro wrestling. That had submissions and pins also, and it's a style I really love to learn one day. But in terms of favorite style, well, I love folk style wrestling. I do it at the Rack on Mondays and Wednesdays at the wrestling club.
Yeah, tell us about the wrestling club.
It's really fun. This is folk style wrestling. It's not pro wrestling, but it's just a small group of people who either wrestled in the past or, want to get into wrestling, can just meet up at the Rack at the auxiliary gym and just, train from 5 to 7 and just, it's fun.
And what days did you say it was?
5 to 7.
On
Monday and Wednesdays.
Monday. Okay, good. So anyone looking to get into wrestling, that is how you do it. Okay, so now what's your favorite style of wrestling?
Favorite style? Okay. If we're talking like pro wrestling, my all-time favorite style would have to be King's Road. This was a style innovated in the 90s by a company called All Japan Pro Wrestling. Well, late 80s, early 90s. It's kind of, the best way I can describe it is that it's like the matches always start with kind of like a slow burn, and then as time goes on, it gets more explosive until, it's just like insane. I can't really like go into detail without showing it, but I would have to recommend the works of Jumbo Tsuruta, Genrichi Tenryu, and the Four Pillars, Mitsuharu Misawa, Kenta Kobashi, Toshiaki Kawada, and actually I almost said the wrong name, Akira Taue.
Yeah, normally I would be down for a live demonstration, but I am the only victim in that scenario, so yeah. I think we're good. So with that, and like I have seen one wrestling match in my entire life, and it was from an indie wrestling Japanese circuit, and like just from what I could tell, Japanese wrestling is like its own beast. That stuff is insane. Like it's just a different kind of wrestling, honestly.
And that's what I really like about pro wrestling is that depending on where it is, the culture is very different for it. America is very entertainment style, very showboaty, I guess is the best way to put it. Japan and Europe, specifically the UK, have a more sports style. Like in Britain, they have rounds in their wrestling matches, and in Japan, there's like, I mean, I'm not saying Japan doesn't have any entertainment. They all have entertainment at some point at the very end, because that's wrestling's origins came from carnivals. This is a little fun fact. Wrestling, it was first real wrestling at carnivals, but ringmasters or whatever, I don't know how to call them, they couldn't really get much money from it, so that's when they started making it, you know, more of a work and getting people like interested in with dramatic stories. So all wrestling is entertainment.
So its origin really is like not as a sport purely for physical like dominance, but it is like something that came to America for like entertainment purposes. Because obviously there's like also classic Greek wrestling, which stems from the Olympics, but you know we're not really basing our modern projections of what wrestling as an industry looks like off of that.
Yeah, but when you like, but there are of course pro wrestling that does have very sport oriented, and Japan is known for innovating that. A lot of MMA comes from Japanese pro wrestling. The first MMA promotion, I believe, either ever or in Japan at least, was Pancrase, which was formed by pro wrestling and MMA legend Minoru Suzuki and Matsukatsu Funaki. I think I'm saying that name right. Yeah, I think that's right.
Cool. All right, so back to the big question. That's the hardest question of all time. What's the best wrestling match that you have ever seen? Or what was your favorite wrestling match, like, ever? I know that there's, like, a billion, trillion, gajillion to choose from, but there's gotta be some standouts, you know, for just, like, in terms of storytelling, at least.
I will name 3 matches. Okay. So the match
I can do 3, yeah.
that got me into pro wrestling was Kurt Angle versus Brock Lesnar, SummerSlam 2003. This match was so good I cited it in my senior speech when during the wrestling award ceremony for my wrestling team. I remember I watched it because I was getting back into wrestling from YouTube videos. Like I was like watching, I got curious about it, so I started watching them, and it just blew me away. It made me realize that you can like tell a story without like, you know, just a movie or a book. You can tell a story purely based on physical combat, you know? And obviously, I probably would have realized that earlier if I got into sports or like MMA or football, but, you know, wrestling also had that like flash to it, you know? And Kurt Angle being this like just genuine like threatening figure, but also being such a goofy character really just made me inspired to do it. Second match that comes to mind is Eddie Kingston versus Chris Hero in a last man standing match at IWA Mid-South. These people, Eddie Kingston I mentioned earlier, and Chris Hero, amazing wrestlers. Like, they're so similar in a way, because they're both heavily inspired by that King's Road Japanese wrestling, but they hate each other in real life. Not even, like, just in pro wrestling. They have legitimate beef.
Nice little rival.
Yeah, and every time they fight each other, they're not really holding back that much. They are punching each other, they're headbutting each other, and you can get some legit brain damage from a headbutt.
Nice.
So they have like some of the most violent matchups, and their IWA Mid-South last man standing match. It like Chris Hero's easily probably the bit more technical, better wrestler. He can do a lot of great catch holds and all that. But Eddie Kingston has this defiant, I will not let you beat me energy to him.
So it really just came down to like pure brass tacks and just like who is willing to do more to get this.
Exactly. And it's just a beautiful, violent match. I love it to death. Third favorite, I would have to say Kenta Kobashi versus Mitsuharu Misawa at I forgot the name of the exact show, but it was at Noah in the year 2003. These two had a very storied rivalry. Misawa, he formed a company, Noah, after leaving All Japan because of kind of issues he was having with the late owner's wife.
We call those creative differences.
Yeah. So he left, and he brought everyone from All Japan except like 2 people with him. And Kenta Kobashi was one of, if not his biggest rivals in All Japan. They've had very storied matches, but Misawa always had the advantage over Kobashi. He was always just a better wrestler at the time. But at 2003, Misawa's kind of slowing down a bit. Kobashi this match is kind of like the ultimate like final battle between these two.
Mm-hmm.
And Kenta Kobashi and Misawa, they give it their all. They're a bit older at that point, but they still have that fire in them. And Misawa and Kobashi do like insane things from each other. For example, at the end of the match, spoilers for
I think this happened in what year?
2003.
Yeah, we're good on spoilers. I think I'll be okay.
At the very end of the match, Kenta Kobashi lifts Misawa over his shoulders. And you see he has a move called the Burning Hammer. It's so deadly, he's only used it 7 times, exactly.
So deadly, he only did it 7 times. Wow.
Essentially, yeah, because...
This dude is the Voldemort of, like, wrestling.
Because essentially the move is, you lift them over your shoulders, and you drop them straight on their neck. Like, full on, head to neck. It is a very unsafe move. And he finally put down Misawa with it for the 1-2-3 to win the Global Heavyweight Crown, I believe it's called, the GHC Championship. And it's a very emotional match. I feel like you do kind of have to watch some of their older matches to kind of understand the history a bit, but even then, on its own, I think it stands out.
And this neck-breaking, paralyzing from the from the head down move has been done 7 times to 7 different people.
Yes. Well, here's the thing. It's a very dangerous move.
That is attempted murder.
It is a very dangerous move. You can do it safely, and one thing I don't like in modern pro wrestling is that there's other wrestlers who have done the move, and then no one has ever kicked out of Kobashi's version of the move.
Right.
Ever. But, of course, modern wrestlers, some of them like, oh, let's do the Burning Hammer onto a bunch of chairs, and then you kick out at 2. And it's just like, well, you're just ruining the aura of the move.
Right. Well, okay. All right. So, with that, I have learned so much about wrestling today already. Thank you so much for coming. We are unfortunately out of time. I could talk about wrestling with you for a million more hours and find out. I want to know what your wrestling costume would look like. I want to figure out everything. What would your intro song be? Okay, answer those 2 questions. Off rip, just click at it. I gotta know.
I kind of want to just wear a traditional folk style wrestling singlet because I wasn't the greatest folk style wrestler. If any of y'all go to the wrestling club, I'm still not the greatest, but I have a lot of pride in doing folk style wrestling, and I love doing it, and I want to continue doing it as much as if I do pro wrestling.
Gotcha.
As for intro music,
that's the big question right there. That's the most important one.
I think I've always wanted to come out to Letterface by Big Pun.
Fun. All right.
Just
That's a hardcore number.
Yeah. Just with the dramatic chainsaw and everything. I think that would be sick.
That would be sick. Alright, well, like I said, thank you so much for joining me today. I learned so much about wrestling. As promised, here is your meatball and mozzarella Hot Pocket.
Yeah, food! I won't starve! Let's go!
Yay! Alright, guys, that was Real Talk. Thank you so much for joining me for another episode. I'm Ansley Hamilton, once again with the George Ann Films. This is my friend and companion in wrestling, Julian Ortiz. Thank you so much for joining me. I will see you guys next week. Bye-bye. Wave bye to the camera. Bye.